So they have quotas in that there has to be a certain number of Pashtuns, there has to be a certain number of Tajiks, etc. But you still find that what ends up happening is the commander of a unit will sort of promote, if he's Pashto, he might promote more Pashtuns in that unit, or there might just be more Pashtuns in that unit, and they become closer. I think overall, actually, as a strategy to try and create a sort of post-ethnic Afghanistan, it's pretty successful in that we didn't feel a lot of racism. You saw that, yes, people, the Pashtuns tended to stay together and they would talk. Of course, they have a different language as well. Each ethnic group has its own language. But within the units, I think it's fairly successful that there's a good mix. And I never saw, although I know that the history of Afghanistan has, explicit racism, and of course the Civil War saw a lot of massacres, ethnic massacres, and that's, after all, one of the Taliban's core ideology is a Pashtun nationalist homeland. They're incredibly racist against all other ethnicities. So, given that history, I thought it was it ran very well. I think the camera is always present and people are always aware of it, and it's always influencing the situation in one way or another. But I need to make sure as a filmmaker that I'm never putting people in danger by being there, for example, or I'm never doing anything that I think is unethical. So, of course, in a funeral you feel awkward, but we did the whole thing with the cooperation of that family. They knew exactly why we were there, what we wanted to do. The same with any of the situations with the soldiers themselves is there was always an understanding. The whole film is almost like a collaboration with those men, that they need to understand why we're there, and in order that we can explain to other people why they're there. I guess it's a matter of perspective. I think if you are, if you fight in an army like that for 9 months and you're not getting paid, I think you are pretty motivated. I don't know what's motivating them, but something is keeping them there. I was amazed that they were willing to fight and not get paid for 9 months. Mike, who was the co-director, he'd been in the British Army, and he always said, there's no way that British soldiers would fight for 9 months under those circumstances and not get paid. I think a lot of them are actually motivated by, what sounds maybe to us like it's really rhetorical. It's like a very nationalist agenda, that they do actually want to protect their country. But I think for them it's true that a lot of them, they legitimately despise the Taliban and they want to fight them. But it's also money, and it's also that for a lot of them they don't have much of a life outside of the army. And for some of them, they can't go home now, because once people know that you're in the army, if you come from, well, Wardouj is a good example where Sunat Allah came from, but you can't really go back to your village because you'd be massacred when they know that you've been in the army. No. You have two hierarchies now in the Afghan army. Jalal is sort of the new generation, where he's actually very well educated and he's been through the officers training program in Kabul. Once those guys are running the army, it's probably, I have no background in the army, by the way, this is just what I picked up being there. Once they're running the army, then I think you'll find a pretty well-trained hierarchy structure. But right now, a lot of the people in charge were, they may have a background from the Mujahideen period, for example. Most of them were promoted because they're past. They're not skilled. A lot of them are illiterate. A lot of them have no, we had a conversation with the battalion commander, and we were talking about Russia, and he said, "Who's the leader of Russia now? It's Stalin, right?" And so that tells you, they're not really very well educated, unfortunately. that when you see in Yakhshal was the first siege, the first kind of gunfight that you see in the film, and Gulbahar was the commander who you see, he kind of gives that speech at the end where he says, they left us in the middle of all this mess. So he's one of those that Jalal and his guys think is really totally incompetent, but is in charge of a battalion. And he came up with this new fantastic strategy in Yakhshal where he said, oh, we're going to go, so, you know, normally if you were going to clear an area, you'd have your men lined up and then you'd walk in this direction so that you can cover a lot of area. So he said, I have a new idea, we're going to go in a straight line, which means, A, you can't cover the whole area you're covering because all you see is the bit you're walking in, and then B, if anyone shoots at you, you can't really shoot back because you're going to end up shooting the guy in front of you. So, you know, these horrific things that cost people's lives, but they do them because they have to do them because they're ordered to. Yeah, I think it's a very pessimistic film. Do I see it getting better? I mean, the problem right now is that the ANA was trained by NATO, and NATO is good at blowing things up, and it's not very good at putting things back together again. Particularly the Americans, not just NATO, but the war was started by the US, and that was their agenda. So they can't really do what needs to be done in Afghanistan. What needs to be done is they need to fight an insurgency. Right now they're fighting as though they were up against another army, but they're not. They're up against an insurgency that has many different motivations and essentially fights like a guerrilla army. So, counterinsurgency traditionally is not the role of the army, it's the role of the police. But as long as America has a huge amount of influence in the Afghan military, which it still does, and it pays their bills, which it's still doing now, it's still 100% funded by the US, they're really not in a position to say, thank you for this training, but we're actually going to go down a different route, which would be, you know, negotiate with the Taliban and insurgents, absorb the least radical elements into the political process, turn over counterinsurgency to the police, probably stop blowing up people's villages might help as well, and probably stop destroying opium would also have a huge effect. So I don't have much hope for them as they are now, no. And that's also based on observation. The country is worse than it was when we made the film, but it's also, the Taliban are getting more successful, and then with more success they're able to acquire more weapons and fund themselves better and train themselves better. And there are parts of the country now where they walk around as like they used to walk around before 2001. Oh, some of them can't. Yeah, so I mean, for some of them who live in areas that are controlled by the Taliban.
By the Taliban.
So if they knew that they were in the army, then they'd get killed when they went home. So that's one of the issues. I mean, there was a guy in the unit who's a Hazara. So the Hazara are one of the smaller minorities in Afghanistan, and traditionally they've been massacred by both sides, actually, the Taliban and the Northern Alliance during the Civil War. And we became good friends with the clerk for the unit that we were working with, and he would say things like, "Oh, I haven't been home in 5 years," and in casual conversation, when we asked why, he would say, "Oh, my leave I couldn't get the schedule right, or I just really like it here, or oh, I had leave but my parents weren't available." And then one night he was just sitting with Mike, who's the co-director, and he said, "I'll tell you the real reason I can't go home. It's because all my family's dead, and they threatened to kill me. So if I go home, I'll be dead as well." He can't afford to do anything else. So he literally hasn't left that unit for 5 years. How did we get in? So Mike, who co-directed it, was in the British Army, and he had been a liaison officer between NATO and the Afghans. And he, at the end of his contract, he thought that he decided he wanted to make a film about it. He'd never made a film before. But he thought he was seeing things that no one else was seeing, that no one else really had access to. And he contacted a friend of his, and she was a mutual friend of mine, and he said, "Who do you think?" The email said, who do you think I should approach to make this film who doesn't mind being shot at? That was the email that I replied to. And I do actually mind being shot at, for the record, but I mean, you know, it's happened enough times that I could still sort of function with it. But then we talked, that was March of 2013, and we spoke for several months just to make sure that we had the right film in mind. And then he went directly to the Afghan army and got embed permission with them. And because he knew that unit so well, those are the guys that we stayed with.